There are stories that take decades to surface, not because they're secrets, but because the person living them doesn't feel the need to explain. For Linda Ronstadt, that moment of explanation came quietly, after years of silence. At 78, the woman once called the First Lady of Rock finally confirmed what many had sensed all along: a truth about how she lived, loved, and defied the expectations that surrounded her entire career. But this wasn't a confession drenched in regret. It was clarity, a moment of honesty that revealed why she made choices that so many had spent decades questioning. For years, the world admired her music, but puzzled over her life. She was the golden voice of the 1970s, the artist who could dominate rock, country, and Latin music without breaking stride. Yet she never walked down the aisle, never played the part the media wrote for her. Rumors swirled, headlines speculated, and fans debated. Why would a woman so loved, so admired, never choose marriage? Some assumed heartbreak, others independence. A few even imagined loneliness. But Linda's explanation, when it finally came, was disarmingly simple. "I wasn't made for it," she said. "I just didn't have that talent." It wasn't bitterness, it wasn't cynicism, it was self-awareness, the kind of insight that takes a lifetime to articulate. What made that statement powerful wasn't just what she said, but when she said it. After decades in the spotlight, with nothing left to prove, she chose honesty over pretense. Her revelation wasn't about rebellion, it was about alignment. She'd lived her entire life in motion, touring, creating, reinventing. For Linda, love was never absent, but confinement was unthinkable. Marriage, she admitted, simply didn't fit the rhythm of her life. The way she described it, commitment wasn't a stage she feared. It was a structure that risked silencing her music. Her truth resonates because it mirrors something larger than her own story. In the era when she rose to fame, women were still expected to balance their success with submission, to prove they could be both powerful and proper. Linda never entertained that duality. She didn't try to appear manageable for the industry or her audience. She refused to frame her worth around a partner or a ring. Instead, she built a career and a life on authenticity, even when that meant standing alone. What's striking, though, is how her independence was never loud. She didn't turn it into a movement or wear it like a statement. It was quiet, steady, and natural. The kind of independence that didn't need to be defended because it simply was. The irony, of course, is that in choosing solitude, she found herself constantly surrounded by friends, collaborators, family, and fans who saw her not as unattached, but as complete in her own right. As she revealed her perspective late in life, fans began to see how every lyric, every performance carried that same conviction. The woman who could sing heartbreak like no one else was never defined by heartbreak itself. She loved deeply, but she loved differently, without possession, without permanence, without apology. Her revelation wasn't just about marriage. It was about her entire philosophy of life: to remain free enough to follow instinct, to create without boundaries, and to live without pretending to be someone she wasn't. Her words reframe her entire legacy, because once you understand why she never settled down, you start to hear her songs differently. The longing in her voice isn't for another person. It's for the freedom to keep moving, to keep discovering. That realization shifts everything. What the world saw as mystery was actually clarity. She knew her truth long before anyone asked for it. But to understand how she came to that clarity, how she developed that sense of self in a world that tried to define her, you have to look at the roots of her story. long before the fame, before the stages, before the headlines, there was a young girl growing up in the desert, in a house where boundaries were blurred and music had no labels. It's there, in the warmth and isolation of the Arizona desert, that Linda Ronstadt's independence began to take shape. The pressure to marry was one of the most consistent narratives that followed Linda throughout her career. It was almost as if success wasn't enough unless it came with a husband by her side. For many artists of her generation, that expectation wasn't just personal, it was professional. A woman in the spotlight was supposed to be balanced by domesticity, by the presence of a man who completed her image. But Linda Ronstadt refused to audition for that role. While others tried to conform to the unspoken rule of fame, that a woman's story must lead to love, she rewrote the script entirely. When asked about her views on marriage, Linda's response wasn't defensive. It was matter of fact. She said she didn't have the talent for compromise. That phrase alone captures the essence of who she was. Compromise, after all, was the one thing she'd spent her entire life avoiding in her music. She wouldn't compromise her sound, her identity, or her values to fit anyone's mold. And that principle extended into her relationships. She saw love not as surrender, but as partnership. And when partnership demanded that she give up her sense of self, she quietly chose solitude instead. In many ways, that choice was radical. The 1970s music scene was still dominated by men. Artists, producers, executives, all of whom expected women to play by the industry's rules. Linda, however, was different. She was outspoken, decisive, and unafraid to challenge authority. Her independence wasn't arrogance, it was survival. She understood that to thrive creatively, she needed full control over her own direction. And she knew what would happen if she gave that up. She'd lose the voice that made her Linda Ronstadt in the first place. Yet, her rejection of convention was never about rejecting love. She loved intensely, and she was loved back by some of the most talented and fascinating people of her era. But she believed that love should enhance freedom, not replace it. She wasn't interested in becoming someone's half. She was already whole. That philosophy confused the media, who preferred simpler stories. To them, her independence looked like loneliness, but to Linda, it was liberation. Still, the world she lived in didn't make it easy. Every interview circled back to the same question: when will you settle down? And each time, she'd give a variation of the same answer. She didn't see marriage in her future. What's powerful, though, is how she delivered those answers. Calmly, humorously, without bitterness. There was no sense of loss in her words, only a quiet certainty that her life was already full. Over time, that refusal to conform became part of her identity, even as she never planned it that way. The same woman who moved between rock, country, opera, and traditional Mexican music without hesitation was the same woman who moved through life without fear of breaking expectations. Her artistry and her personal choices shared a single thread: a refusal to be limited by definition. In her own way, she lived like her music: fluid, evolving, unpredictable, and free. Her revelation at 78 simply confirmed what her life had already shown: that she had never been incomplete. Marriage wasn't missing from her story. It just didn't belong to it. And while the world debated her choices, she quietly built a legacy that outlasted every headline and every assumption. Her truth didn't just challenge the norms of her generation, it foreshadowed the mindset of today's women, who value authenticity over appearance, purpose over conformity. What Linda said at 78 was the same message she'd been singing her entire life: only now the world was finally ready to hear it. But the roots of that defiance, that clarity, didn't appear out of thin air. They were planted long before fame ever touched her name, in a home where music, language, and culture blurred into something uniquely her own. To understand how Linda Ronstadt became the woman who never followed anyone's rules, you have to return to the place where her sound and her spirit were born. To understand how Linda Ronstadt became the woman who refused to be boxed in, by genre, by love, by expectation, you have to start where her story began. In the open desert skies of Tucson, Arizona. That's where her independence first took shape, long before the fame and the flashing lights. Tucson wasn't just home. It was a living metaphor for the kind of woman she would become. Vast, unpredictable, and uncontainable. The desert doesn't rush, it doesn't bend, and it doesn't apologize for its emptiness. And neither did she. In that environment, Linda learned early on that boundaries could be illusions. Her childhood home was a crossroads of cultures and sounds. Her father, Gilbert Ronstadt, was a musician who serenaded the family with old Mexican canciones, while her mother, Ruth, nurtured classical harmony and discipline. Music wasn't just entertainment, it was identity. Inside the Ronstadt home, it was common to hear a Spanish ballad one moment and a Bach prelude the next. That duality, that constant dance between two worlds, gave Linda something rare: the instinct to blend instead of choosing sides. From a young age, she absorbed everything. While other kids played outside, Linda was experimenting with harmonies, learning to shape her voice around whatever sound inspired her. She performed folk songs with her siblings, sometimes turning the family's living room into an impromptu stage. The Ronstadt home became a rehearsal hall of imagination, where no sound was off limits. By the time she reached her teens, her ear had already been trained to respect no genre and fear no experiment. That early exposure to musical diversity would later become her trademark and her shield. When she finally left for Los Angeles in the mid-1960s, that fearless curiosity came with her. She wasn't just another singer chasing fame. She carried with her a sound that defied categorization. Los Angeles, at the time, was exploding with possibilities, but was also ruthless toward dreamers. For every musician who found a record deal, hundreds vanished into the noise. Linda's weapon was her authenticity. When she joined forces with fellow musicians to form the Stone Ponies, her voice immediately stood out. It wasn't just powerful, it was pure. Listeners could hear emotion without artifice, vulnerability without weakness. The band's breakout hit, Different Drum, was more than a song. It was a statement of self, a declaration that Linda would always choose her own rhythm. Ironically, the lyrics themselves mirrored her real-life philosophy about independence and love. "You and I travel to the beat of a different drum," she sang, and decades later, those words would sound almost prophetic. That single line captured the spirit that would guide her entire journey. As success started to build, Linda's instincts told her to keep moving. Where many artists would have clung to the sound that made them famous, she evolved, constantly, fearlessly. One night, she'd sing country rock in a smoky club. The next, she'd be exploring folk ballads or soul arrangements. She refused to belong to a single musical tribe. To her, identity wasn't about being one thing. It was about becoming. That's why peers like Jackson Browne, J.D. Souther, and Don Henley admired her, not just for her talent, but for her refusal to play by anyone's rules. But with fame came something Linda hadn't expected: curiosity about her private life. As her songs filled stadiums and her albums topped charts, the media's lens began to zoom in on the woman behind the voice. Her defiance, once celebrated as artistic bravery, was now framed as mystery. Who was she when the stage lights went dark? Who did she love? Why didn't she settle down? The same independence that gave her power in music now became the fuel for endless speculation. It's in this contrast between her musical freedom and public curiosity that her story took its next, more complicated turn. Because while Linda Ronstadt mastered the art of navigating between genres, she was about to learn how difficult it was to navigate love under the glare of fame. When you live your life under a spotlight, even the most private feelings become public property. For Linda Ronstadt, fame brought adoration, but it also brought intrusion. By the time she reached the height of her career, her relationships were no longer just personal choices. They were headlines. Every photograph, every public appearance became another clue in the media's ongoing obsession with her love life. And while the world romanticized her partners, Linda saw something much more ordinary. Two people trying to connect amid extraordinary circumstances. Her relationship with singer-songwriter J.D. Souther was the kind of partnership that artists dream about. They shared music, creativity, and a bond that came from mutual respect. He wrote songs that captured the subtleties of love, and she sang them with a depth that made them unforgettable. But as much as their chemistry produced magic in the studio, real life was harder to harmonize. Both were fiercely independent, and the same intensity that created beauty on record sometimes clashed behind closed doors. When it ended, it wasn't a scandal. It was a quiet acceptance that two restless spirits couldn't stand still long enough to meet in the middle. Then came a romance that no one saw coming, one that pushed her even further into the spotlight. In the late 1970s, Linda began dating California Governor Jerry Brown. Suddenly, the Queen of Rock was attending political dinners and campaign events. It was the kind of pairing that made headlines across the country, the rock star and the rising politician. For a while, it worked. They respected each other's worlds, and their connection was genuine. But the public fascination was relentless. The cameras never stopped flashing, and every gesture was analyzed. What began as companionship soon became theater, and eventually they both realized that privacy was a luxury they could no longer afford. Still, Linda never let that experience harden her. She moved forward with the same grace she brought to her music. In the early 1980s, rumors linked her briefly to a young Jim Carrey, long before Hollywood turned him into a superstar. The age gap and difference in career stages made it easy fodder for tabloids, but Linda brushed off the chatter. She didn't explain herself, didn't defend her choices. If anything, she treated love like she treated her songs. Each one a moment in time, no less meaningful for being brief. The most public chapter of her romantic life came with George Lucas, the visionary behind Star Wars. The idea of two icons from such different worlds falling in love captivated everyone. For a time, it seemed like the storybook ending fans had waited for. The artist and the filmmaker, each at the peak of creative power. But behind the glamour, reality proved less cinematic. Their schedules, their pressures, their fame, all of it made sustaining intimacy nearly impossible. The engagement eventually ended, leaving behind curiosity and speculation, but no bitterness. Linda moved on, quietly, carrying only what mattered, the lessons. What stands out through all these stories isn't the endings, but the way Linda handled them. She didn't hide. She didn't perform vulnerability for the cameras. Instead, she carried herself with quiet dignity. Every relationship, whether long or brief, deepened her understanding of love, not as possession, but as connection. She learned that sometimes love's most powerful form is the freedom to walk away without resentment. By the time the tabloids moved on, Linda had already found her next act, one that didn't involve romance at all, but something far more lasting. Because while the world continued to ask, who will she marry? Linda was already asking a different question. What kind of family do I want to build? That question would lead her to make one of the most defining choices of her life. A choice that proved independence didn't mean isolation. And that family could be rewritten on her own terms. By the time the headlines about her romances began to fade, Linda Ronstadt had already turned her focus towards something far deeper, creating a life that reflected her own vision of love. For years, the world had asked her when she would marry, but Linda was quietly asking herself an entirely different question. What if love didn't need to look like everyone else's version to be real? That question would become the foundation of her next chapter. One not about relationships or fame, but about, in the early 1990s, while many of her peers were chasing comebacks or tabloid relevance, Linda made a decision that caught the world off guard. She adopted a daughter, Mary Clementine. There was no press conference, no magazine reveal, just a quiet shift in her life that spoke louder than any announcement ever could. For Linda, motherhood was not a detour from her independence. It was an extension of it. She had always defined her world by instinct. And this instinct told her she was ready to nurture in her own way. Raising Mary, Linda approached parenthood with the same authenticity that had guided her music. There were no staged photo ops, no performative moments of celebrity parenting. Instead, she created a home filled with art, laughter, and the same cultural richness she had grown up with. Music filled the air, but not the kind of music made for fame. She sang lullabies in Spanish, shared stories about her family's heritage, and surrounded her daughter with creative energy rather than material excess. Years later, she expanded her family again by adopting a son, Carlos. Together, they became her world, not a headline, but a haven. The decision to adopt as a single woman was still unconventional in that era. Critics whispered. Some called it untraditional. But Linda was never one to measure her worth by public approval. She had spent a lifetime breaking molds. This was just another one. What she built wasn't rebellion, but redefinition. She showed that love and family didn't have to fit within marriage to be complete. Her home wasn't about structure. It was about connection. And she lived it without apology. As her children grew, Linda began to retreat from the relentless pace of her earlier life. The woman who had once lived out of suitcases and stadium lights traded the chaos of touring for the quiet rhythms of home. First in San Francisco and later back in Tucson, she created a sanctuary that reflected who she'd always been, grounded, private, and free. The desert once again became her comfort, a full circle return to where her story began. But this quieter life didn't mean disappearance. Linda still poured herself into her passions, mentoring, supporting the arts, and preserving musical traditions close to her heritage. She raised her children with the same values that had shaped her: curiosity, empathy, and courage. For Mary and Carlos, having Linda Ronstadt as a mother meant growing up surrounded by creativity, but never overshadowed by it. She didn't want them to inherit fame. She wanted them to inherit freedom. Her approach to family echoed the same principle that guided her entire career: authenticity over appearance. While others measured success in records sold or relationships maintained, Linda measured it in moments. Shared meals, late-night conversations, quiet laughter in a world that once demanded noise. That kind of peace can't be staged, and Linda knew it. But just as she seemed to have found balance, a gentle rhythm between the life she had lived and the one she was building, something unexpected arrived. A challenge that would test the very strength she'd carried all her life. The same voice that had soared through decades of music, the one that made her name legendary, began to falter. And in the silence that followed, Linda Ronstadt once again showed the world what true resilience looks like. It started subtly. Small changes in her voice that only she could hear. Notes that once came effortlessly began to waver. At first, she blamed exhaustion, the natural wear that comes from years of touring and performing. But deep down, Linda knew something was shifting. The woman whose life had been built on sound was beginning to face silence. When doctors finally gave her the diagnosis, Parkinson's disease, it changed everything. But true to her nature, Linda faced it not with despair, but with honesty. For an artist whose identity was so deeply tied to her voice, losing it could have been devastating. And yet, Linda refused to see it as an ending. She called it a transition, another evolution in a life that had never followed predictable lines. She once said, "I had my turn. I sang for 50 years. Now, I listen." That perspective said everything about who she was. She didn't cling to what was fading. She embraced what remained. And what remained was immense: her mind. Her humor, her memories, her family, her music, all intact, all still vibrant. In her quieter years, Linda began to reflect more publicly on her life. She wrote, she spoke, she shared stories from decades in an industry that had both celebrated and constrained her. What people discovered wasn't just nostalgia, but wisdom. Stripped of the microphone, she became even more powerful. Her reflections on fame, love, and independence revealed a woman who had lived on her own terms from beginning to end and never once apologized for it. Her family became her anchor through it all. Mary and Carlos, now grown, were no longer just her children. They were her companions, her protectors, and her pride. The same independence that had once set her apart now became a quiet form of strength that carried her through illness with grace. The home she had built, the one the world once questioned, became her sanctuary. The laughter of her children, the familiar hum of the desert outside her window, these became her new kind of music. Even as her physical voice grew quiet, her influence only deepened. Younger artists began to rediscover her catalog, not just as fans, but as students. They saw in her story something rare, a blueprint for living authentically in a business built on illusion. Linda never played the part she was told to play, and now her life stood as proof that integrity outlasts fame. She'd lost her singing voice, yes, but she'd never lost her voice as a woman. In interviews, she often brushed aside sympathy. "Everybody loses something," she'd say, almost casually. "I just lost it earlier." But those who listened closely could hear what she really meant. That loss is only tragic if you stop living. For Linda Ronstadt, even silence became a kind of song, one filled with acceptance, courage, and love. Her health may have changed her path, but it didn't rewrite her story. In fact, it brought it full circle. The young girl from Tucson, who once found freedom in music, had, decades later, found peace in stillness. And as her voice faded into memory, her truth only grew louder. That strength isn't always about sound. Sometimes it's about knowing when to let the world listen to the silence you've earned. As the years went by and her condition gradually worsened, Linda Ronstadt could have chosen to retreat completely. to disappear quietly and let her legend speak for her. But that was never her style. Even as her voice slipped away, she refused to let silence define her. Instead, she made a choice that would surprise the world once again. She began speaking openly about her illness, her limitations, and the truth of what she was facing. Her admission didn't come with drama or self-pity. In fact, it arrived the same way Linda had approached everything else, with disarming honesty. In interviews, she simply said, "I can't sing anymore." There was no attempt to soften the blow or to disguise it with poetic phrasing. Just truth. For fans who had worshipped her for decades, the news felt like heartbreak. How could one of the greatest voices of her generation, the woman whose sound had defined an era, be silenced by something so cruel? But Linda didn't see it that way. To her, the end of singing was not the end of being an artist. It was the start of something more introspective, something she had never truly had before: stillness. For the first time in her adult life, she wasn't on a plane, a stage, or a recording schedule. She was simply living, reading, reflecting, revisiting the moments that had made her who she was. And in that space, something powerful began to happen. Her voice, the one she had always expressed through music, found a new outlet through storytelling. When she published her memoir, Simple Dreams, the world got to see a side of Linda that few had known. It wasn't a tell-all or a list of scandals. Instead, it was an honest, heartfelt reflection on art, identity, and the constant push between love and independence. She didn't romanticize her past, she examined it. Every chapter felt like a song without music, direct, vulnerable, and deeply human. The book reminded everyone that Linda Ronstadt had always been more than a singer. She was a storyteller, and she still had stories to tell. Her openness about Parkinson's disease also carried an unexpected effect. It sparked conversations about aging, illness, and dignity, topics often avoided in the entertainment world. Linda faced it with remarkable candor. She talked about the frustrations, the physical changes, the loss of control, but also the gratitude that came with perspective. "I had 50 years of singing," she said. "That's a lot to be thankful for." It wasn't resignation. It was grace. And perhaps most touching of all was how her circle of friends rallied around her. Icons like Dolly Parton and Emmylou Harris, with whom Linda had shared some of her most beautiful harmonies, remained by her side. Their voices still carried the songs the three had once shared, but now they carried something deeper: devotion. The bond between them wasn't built on fame. It was built on a kind of sisterhood that outlasts applause. In many ways, Linda's decision to live publicly with her condition turned her into something she'd never sought to be: an example, not of perfection, but of authenticity in the face of loss. People who had once idolized her voice began to admire her courage even more. She showed that vulnerability doesn't erase strength, it reveals it. And that perhaps the most powerful sound a person can make is the truth about who they really are. Her life became quieter, yes, but not smaller. Her world was still filled with laughter, family, friends, and the desert skies that had always comforted her. The same voice that had once echoed across stadiums now resonated in a different way. Through her wisdom, her humor, and her refusal to surrender her identity to the silence that tried to claim her. And just when the world thought her story was over, Linda's legacy began to grow even louder. Because while her voice may have fallen silent, her impact, that unmistakable imprint of truth and artistry, was only becoming clearer with time. Today, when people talk about Linda Ronstadt, they don't just talk about the music. They talk about the woman, the force, the standard, the courage she embodied in every era of her life. Her songs are still timeless, but it's her story that continues to inspire new generations. The story of a woman who refused to be categorized, controlled, or diminished. In an industry built on trends, she built something far more enduring: integrity. From the 1960s through the early 2000s, Linda's career traced the evolution of modern music itself. She mastered every style she touched: rock, country, opera, mariachi, folk, and pop. Not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because she was curious. She believed in the emotional truth of every song, no matter the genre. And that belief turned her into one of the most versatile vocalists in American history. Artists across generations, from Sheryl Crow to Adele, cite her as a defining influence, not just for her sound, but for her fearlessness in taking creative risks. But beyond the music, what Linda leaves behind is a lesson, a reminder that true strength comes from authenticity. She showed that you could be powerful without being loud, that you could be kind without being weak, and that you could live freely without needing permission. She redefined what it meant to be a female artist at a time when women in music were often expected to be decorative rather than directive. She wasn't a product of her era. She reshaped it. Her story also carries something deeply human: the idea that identity isn't fixed. It evolves, just like her voice did. From her days in the Arizona desert to the heights of Hollywood and the quiet corners of her later life, Linda's journey is proof that every ending is just a new form of expression waiting to be discovered. Even as illness took her physical ability to sing, it never took her spirit. The silence she now lives in is not emptiness, it's resonance. It's the echo of everything she's already said, sung, and lived. In 2014, Linda Ronstadt was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a recognition long overdue. She couldn't attend the ceremony due to her health, but her peers performed her songs in tribute, and the entire audience rose to its feet. It was a moment that transcended nostalgia. The applause wasn't just for the hits. It was for the woman behind them, for her defiance, her grace, and her unflinching truth. Years later, when she received the Kennedy Center honor, that standing ovation returned once more. Linda watched from her seat, modest as ever, smiling with the quiet dignity of someone who had never chased validation and yet received it in abundance. The recognition was more than symbolic. It was the world finally catching up to the woman who had always been ahead of her time. Her legacy, though, isn't frozen in those ceremonies. It lives on every time someone dares to be original, every time an artist breaks away from expectations, every time a woman refuses to shrink to fit a narrative. Linda Ronstadt's story reminds us that greatness isn't about perfection, it's about truth. And maybe that's the real music she leaves behind. Not the notes, but the message. That freedom, once found, can never be taken away. So even though Linda no longer sings, her voice is still everywhere. In the courage of those who follow her path, in the harmony of the songs she left behind, and in the silence that still hums with her strength. Because some voices don't fade. They just change form, and in doing so, they last forever. Family.